Hi everyone. Today we're going to look at Japan's traditional alcoholic beverage, which is sake. And please say sake, not sake. Sake is not only incorrect, it triggers me. So it's sake. We'll say it one more time. Sake. All right, great. So specifically what I want to talk about today is answering that question, what is sake? I'm going to start with the definition of sake, look at ways of brewing sake, examining various types of sake, and looking at the folks who brew sake. Now, the history of sake goes back to at least the 8th century in Japan, probably earlier. I'll talk about the history in later lectures. I'm just going to cover the basics of what sake is this week. So here we go. So the question, what is sake? Well, sake is not a spirit. It's not distilled the way vodka or another distilled alcohol are created. So it's not distilled, even though it's poured in a tiny glass and looks like a shot. It's not a distilled beverage at all, nor is it a wine. Wines come from fruit, typically grapes, and the grapes or other fruit have sugar within them. And that sugar will naturally ferment. Put some fruit in a bucket and, well, if you're lucky, it'll turn into some kind of alcoholic beverage. Maybe not a very good one, but it'll happen naturally. However, sake is made from grain, typically rice, and there needs to be a necessary step to turn that grain, to make that grain, the starches in that grain available as sugars for fermentation. Happens naturally in wine, but there needs to be a step in sake. Beer making faces the same problem. And the way it works in beer making is that something is malted. You take a grain, you germinate the grain, and you sprout it, and you stop the malting process. But that's enough to start the transformation of starches into sugars. Well, you can't do that same process with rice, so you instead use koji, this wonderful mold. So koji is what does a very important job of taking the starches in the rice and turning them into sugars and making them available for fermentation. So the basic definition of sake, we see it's not a wine at all. In fact, it's a beverage made now from rice, from this wonderful mold called koji, from yeast, and from water. Interestingly enough, in most of sake's history, brewers didn't know about the existence of yeast, and that was true for beer brewing too. Yeast is just floating around in the air. They didn't know it existed, nor did they know that koji was a microorganism, but still they were able to use it for their fermentation. Now, I said this basic recipe for sake is rice, koji, yeast, and water. Well, a lot of brewers today will add lactic acid, and lactic acid helps the fermentation process along. It used to be that brewers historically would create their own lactic acid. Lactic acid is something that happens naturally. Lactic acid fermentation is what is used to make yogurt. And it's very helpful if you're fermenting something because it gets rid of other types of things that might get in the way of that fermentation process, other types of microorganisms. So rather than build up lactic acid naturally, brewers today, most of them will add lactic acid. And many add alcohol too to their sake. Some say it's to bring out the flavor notes, the aromas of finer sake. Others, I think it's simply just to make more sake. You put more alcohol in it, and alcohol is brewer's alcohol. And historically, brewers in Japan had a problem with adding too much alcohol to their sake, but I'll talk about that in a later lecture. Now, in beer making, what happens is there's a two-step process of fermentation. There's the process of breaking down the starches into sugars and the sugars into alcohol. Well, in sake, that happens at the same time. So oftentimes, or what we say about sake brewing is that it's simultaneous fermentation. There's two things happening at once. Koji is breaking down the starches and sugars, and these sugars are being transformed into alcohol through wonderful yeast. This happens in the same tank at the same time. Sake, the last thing we can say is it's a seasonal beverage. It's typically today brewed in the winter. Well, actually, major brewers are brewing year-round, but historically it was brewed in the winter and then consumed in the fall after having a period of resting in the brewery. So, some basics of sake. Let's dig a little bit further. First of all, I want to say something about serving temperature. Oftentimes, you go have sake at a Japanese restaurant and it's served piping hot, almost hot like tea. And people wonder, is this the correct beverage, correct temperature for serving sake? Well, if it's served piping hot in a restaurant like that, maybe not. But really, there are no hard and fast rules about serving sake. I warn against the sake that's served in a lot of Japanese restaurants just because you don't know how long it's been heated and the quality of the sake may not be very good. And there's lots of sort of warnings about certain restaurants and their sake practices. People don't know what they're doing. But by and large, sake can be served at any temperature, very cold or very, very hot. And that's another thing that differentiates it between other beverages like beer and wine. Wine and beer, you can't play around with the serving temperatures so much. But sake you can. It really changes the character of the sake. So it's a fun experiment to try a sake at a colder temperature, then at room temperature, and then a warmer temperature, and then see what you like. Can sake be aged? No, generally not. Sake should be drunk when it's new. So within the first 2 years that it's been shipped. And that shipping date is usually on the bottle. There is aged sake. I'll talk about that a little bit later in this lecture. But generally, sake is not like wine where you want to keep it around. So something about the term sake. Sake literally means alcohol. And you think back in the day in Japan, up until the end of the 19th century, sake was practically the only alcohol. Okay, yeah, there was some distilled beverages, there's shochu, there's a little bit of wine, a little bit of beer that's being produced in Japan, but way up to the 19th century, sake was nearly all of the alcoholic beverages produced in Japan. So sake really is synonymous with alcohol, and indeed in Japanese the word sake can mean alcohol. So to be specific, people say nihonshu or seishu to indicate that we're talking about specific sake made from rice and koji. Back to that point about distilled alcohol, well, most of the sake today contains it in some degree or another. But there is another type of sake. It says pure sake as a translation of junmai. Probably that's not a very politically correct translation. Maybe it's better just to say all rice sake for junmai. So one distinction that we'll see in sake making is sake that is all rice or junmai against sake that has added alcohol. And some people will say that junmai sake is the only sake. Others will say, well, all children are good. All sake is good. I guess it really depends on what you're looking for. But all these could be called seishu and nihonshu. Before we go any further, we should say something about sake etiquette, how to pour sake. Well, say you have a wonderful tokuri there, which is a little sake container. Maybe it's just served in that because it's pretty or because you warmed it up. Then if you want to serve your friend, you use both hands to pour. And likewise, if you're receiving sake, you receive it in both hands, holding the cup from the bottom. And then if your friend has poured for you, you quickly take that tokuri from them and pour for them. So a little sake etiquette. Good rule of thumb is to use both hands, and if your friend's glass is empty, keep it full. So today, sake is differentiated many different ways, and it's good to know some of these terms. I've already encountered the question about whether sake has added alcohol or not. But another way of thinking about sake is the degree to which the rice is milled. This is very critical. When you think about sake being made of water, koji, rice, well, what can differentiate one sake from another? Well, one question is, does it have alcohol or not? Or is it a junmai without alcohol? Another is, how much has that rice been milled or polished? So what legally differentiates different types of sake is that polishing rate of the rice. This is a legal definition in Japan, mind you. So the top sake, and we'll look at the polishing rates in just a second. The top sake is a daiginjo, and that means that 50% of the rice has been milled away. It's gone. Second rank is a ginjo, and that means that 40% of the rice has been milled away. So imagine a rice grain, and it's been polished. If more than half of it or half of it at least has been polished away, we can call that a daiginjo. If 40% of it has been polished away, it's a ginjo. And those could be either all rice sake, junmai, or they could be what's called honjozu, or added alcohol sake. So junmai shu, honjozo, two distinctions. Those are premium sake. The daiginjos, the ginjos are premium sake. They have special milling rates. Beneath that, and most of the sake that's on the market is table sake, which has a much lower milling rate. So let's look at those milling rates right now. Here's a breakdown of this, and this is an illustration from John Gottner's Sake Pro course that I took many years ago in Chicago, and it's just a great opportunity to really dig deep into sake. And John offers this online, and John does them in person, and hopefully he won't mind me using this table, just using an excerpt of it. But it really lays out very nicely the different types of sake and the legal distinctions between it. So looking at the premium types of sake, the daiginjo and the ginjo, we can see that with the daiginjo, 50% of the sake remains after milling. With ginjo, it's 60%. With your table sake or your regular sake, junmai, honjozu, then it's at 70%. If it doesn't have any kind of distinction, if it's just regular junmai or regular honjozo. Honjozo, again, means that there's alcohol that's been added. That's been milled to 70%, but 85% of the sake today is what's called table sake or futsushu. And futsushu, there's no set milling rates, so it's something to keep in mind. Futsushu, you see these for sale in supermarkets sometimes. They're labeled futsushu, or sometimes they're not even labeled at all. You see them in packaged in milk cartons. So really, the takeaway from this is that what determines a quality sake, at least in terms of its official rankings from the Japanese government, is the milling rate. Now, a daiginjo might taste a very special way, or a ginjo might have a nice characteristic about it. These tend to be very floral, melon notes, rather ethereal tasting. But a good honjozu or junmai shu, it can be equally as appealing. So just a matter of taste and preference. In other words, this doesn't necessarily mean that one sake tastes better than another. And indeed, these ordinary futsushu at the bottom, they might taste pretty good too. One question that might come up is, and if you come from a background of wine, are there specific sake regions, and do they have certain characteristics about them? Well, yes and no. In the north, you tend to have very fine grained, delicate sake. Northern Japan, so places Iwate, Yamagata, and so on. But in the south, you get these very umami laden sakes. You can see here there's some numbers on the chart. That's the sake value meter, SVM value, which measures the density of sake. And the higher the number, the drier the sake. Now, most of the sake today comes from Nada, which is the Kobe, Osaka region. They make about a third of the sake. The sake there historically and today is very dry, very masculine. It's due to the hard water that's used. In Kyoto or near Kyoto is Fushimi, which has softer water and a sweeter taste, more feminine, delicate. This is the sake of Gekkeikan and others. Hiroshima too has very soft waters and produces some lovely sake. I guess the rule of thumb here is that you can find good sake all over Japan. In some regions, yes, they have a reputation for producing drier sake, like up in the north, or sweeter sake, in Kyoto. But really, brewers all over Japan can produce all kinds of sake. And indeed, if you're making a daiginjo, a lot of the daiginjo sort of hit the same notes no matter where they're made. So yes, sake regionality is a thing, but it's not something to get too wrapped up in, I think. It's just interesting to know where your sake comes from, because you can learn something about the culture and history of the region. Here are three of my favorite sake. I just kind of chose it at random. One is Nambu Bijin. You can usually find this in American supermarkets. It's a very dry sake from Iwate Prefecture. And then when I was in Saga once, I discovered Azuma Ichi. I really like that sake. It's a little more sweet. It's meaty, kind of has barbecue notes. And then in Kochi, in Shikoku, is Tsukasa Botan, which is dry like a sake from Niigata, but it's very drinkable. So I like all kinds of sake, or used to when I was drinking it. Here are three of my favorites. I don't drink so much sake anymore. So how do you make sake? What are the steps? Well, a brewer will tell you it's koji, moto, and tsukuri. And what that refers to is the process of making koji, the process of making the yeast fermentation starter, the moto, which is also called the shubo, and then the process of brewing, which is called tsukuri. So I don't know if that little mantra is helpful to you, koji, moto, tsukuri, but that's traditionally how brewers will talk about it. But there's some additional steps that need to be spoken about. First of all, it's important to mill the rice. As we saw, that could determine a lot about what happens with the rice, with the sake that you're producing. So milling is very critical. And then comes steaming the rice. The rice is steamed. It's not boiled, but steamed in these huge cauldrons. Then koji is being made or made. Some of the rice is taken aside and turned into koji. And then there's the yeast fermentation process, the creation of the moto. Finally, the sake will be pressed so that the solids that are left over from the brewing are pressed out and the liquid is kept. So separating the yeast, the solids from the liquid is the pressing process. Then the sake is filtered and pasteurized and bottled, and we wait a while to enjoy it. So I'm going to look at each one of these steps up closely. First of all, looking at the waters. And I guess we're back to geography here. I said earlier that Nada produces 1/3 of the sake in Japan today, and one of the reasons is because Nada is very famous for its hard water, which is low in iron content. And iron can do nasty things to sake. It can turn the sake a dark color. It can affect the taste. Manganese is bad too if it's in the water. So Nara became a brewing powerhouse in part because of the hard water that was used there. Because this sort of approach to sake, and kind of boiling down history a little bit, became so dominant, it was harder for brewers in areas like Fushimi or Hiroshima, which had softer water, because they had to develop techniques in how to work with it. But they did in the early 20th century. Softer water, they found, takes more time, but some say it makes better sake. When you have hard water like in Nara, you have a very vigorous and fast fermentation, but softer water, it takes a longer time. Brewers traditionally got their water from wells, but now, of course, if you're a sake brewer, you can get your water from anywhere, and then you can make it hard or soft or do what you want. But still, there's this traditional lore that Nara water is hard and Fushimi water is soft, and like Hiroshima, or that Niigata has famous waters. I mean, it's part of the lore of sake making, but maybe not as important as it once was historically. All right, moving on to the rice. Rice, of course, adds most of the flavor to sake. And rice is a very important ingredient to sake, so I have to say something about the rice. You can make sake from table rice, and indeed, most of the sake that's brewed today is made from table rice. So a lot of the table sake, the futsushu, is made from table rice. But if you are a brewer who wants something a little bit different, then you might turn to a sake rice or a sakamai. What's the difference between a sakamai or sake rice and a rice that's used for eating? Well, sakamai tend to grow a little bit taller. They have taller stalks. But what really sets them apart is they're 25% larger. Typically, each grain of rice is 25% larger than a typical rice that's used for eating. And they have a higher concentration of starch. And starch is what fuels that process of starch to sugar conversion that's necessary for alcohol brewing. So a lot of brewers will turn to these sake rice, these sakamai, for their brewing. And the most famous variety of sake rice is called Yamada Nishiki, and it's grown in Hyogo Prefecture. And most breweries, wherever they are in Japan, will use this Yamada Nishiki, which kind of undercuts the idea of regional sake. If they're all using the same rice from the same area in Japan, then, well, how different can they be? But of course they can be. I mean, there's local techniques and local water, et cetera, but something also to bear in mind. So, sakamai. And in America, sakamai is grown in California. We have Cal Rose, which is almost like a table rice, but now in Arkansas, Isbell Farms is growing various types of sakamai, including Yamada Nishiki. So the process of milling. This is the very important process of removing the rice bran and then the outer coats of the rice to get rid of the bran and the fats and the proteins that'll affect the taste. And the idea here is to get to that lovely starching center. Now, if you're milling rice, if you're polishing rice for table rice, for eating, then you're just going to be milling about 8% of it away. So you're leaving 92% of the rice in place. But if you're going to create sake, well, remember, if you're making daiginjo, you're going to be polishing 50% of that rice away. Or a ginjo, it's 40% that will be polished away. Junmai, honjozu, you're just going to be polishing 30% of the way, so 70% of it is remains. This takes a long time, It could take up to 4 days to polish the rice to make daiginjo. And you might ask, well, what do they do with that extra rice that's been polished away? Well, you can do all kinds of things with it. It has culinary uses. You can make crackers out of it. Don't worry, they're not getting rid of it. But still, there's a lot of effort to to polish the rice and get down to that starchy core. Usually after the rice is milled, it's put aside for a couple weeks so that it can absorb moisture. So the technical term for rice milling is seimai buai, and that refers to the degree the rice is milled before it's brewing. So it's kind of the amount of rice that's remaining after the rice is milled away. And here we can see, and this is another great image I borrowed from John Gottner's Sake Pro course. You can see the difference between top grade Yamada Nishiki that's been unmilled, the rice that's been milled away to the grade of Ginjo. So 45% of it has been milled away. And then Daiginjo grade rice, where over half of it has been milled away. So little tiny circles of rice. I'm going to stop here, and that'll end part 1 of this lecture, and we'll cover part 2 the next time. Thanks for your attention. And just as a word of reference, and I'll have this at the end of the second part, a lot of the material from this lecture comes from John Gottner's Sake Pro course, his Sake Confidential and other writings, and a bit of sake history from my book, Kampai, The History of Sake. So we'll see you next time.